#HOA called the cops on me for doing this in my yard. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sandwiched between a cable bill and a grocery store flyer. Official HOA letterhead, Pristine Pines Community Association stamped in forest green at the top. I might have missed it entirely had my neighbor Dolores not texted me a cryptic, "Check your mail." They're at it again. They. The nebulous entity that was our homeowners association board. 5 retirees with nothing better to do than measure grass height with rulers and document unauthorized lawn ornaments with the dedication of wildlife photographers staking out endangered species. I tossed the cable bill aside and tore open the HOA letter, already feeling my blood pressure rise. "Dear Mr. Fletcher," it began. Always so formal. "It has come to our attention that the vegetation in your front yard has exceeded our community standards as outlined in Section 7.3 of the Pristine Pines Covenant. Please remedy this situation within 72 hours to avoid further action." Further action. The vague threat that hung over all of our heads in Pristine Pines. I crumpled the letter and tossed it toward the recycling bin. It missed, which felt appropriate for my day so far. My name is Daniel Fletcher. 42 years old, divorced for 3 years, and the reluctant owner of a 3-bedroom colonial in what the real estate agent had called the most desirable planned community in the county. What she'd failed to mention was that planned meant micromanaged down to the color of your mailbox flag. I'd bought the house post-divorce, desperate for something turnkey after years in a fixer-upper that my ex-wife and I had never quite fixed up. The community had seemed perfect: quiet streets, good schools for when my daughter visited on weekends, and landscaping that looked like it had been designed by someone with a protractor and a very limited color palette. The HOA had seemed like a small price to pay for order. That was before I'd met Gerald Harrington, HOA president and self-appointed emperor of Pristine Pines. I walked to my front window and stared out at my offending yard. The grass was maybe half an inch taller than regulation height. I'd been planning to mow it this weekend, but apparently that timeline didn't align with Gerald's vision for suburban perfection. My phone buzzed. Dolores again. "What did they get you for?" her text read. "Grass too tall." The horror. Brace yourself. They cited the Johnsons for unapproved wind chimes. Wind chimes, Dan. I laughed despite myself. Dolores was the unofficial resistance leader in our little community. At 65, she had the time, energy, and complete lack of concern for consequences that made her the perfect thorn in the HOA's side. "What's the penalty for wind chime infractions these days?" I replied. "Firing squad at dawn. Or a $50 fine." Gerald still deciding. I tossed my phone onto the couch and collapsed next to it. It had been a long day at the architectural firm where I worked, designing buildings far more interesting than the cookie-cutter houses of Pristine Pines. The last thing I needed was to break out the lawn mower on a Tuesday evening. The thing was, I'd been planning something for that patch of yard anyway. Something that definitely wouldn't align with Section 7.3 of the Pristine Pines Covenant. My daughter, Sophie, was going through an intense biology phase at 11 years old. During her last weekend visit, we'd watched a documentary about declining pollinator populations. She'd been devastated. "But what can we do, Dad?" she'd asked, her eyes wide with that earnest concern that only children can truly muster. And I, wanting to be the hero dad, had promised her we'd plant a wildflower garden to attract bees and butterflies. We'd ordered seeds online, researched native species, and planned to break ground this coming weekend when she returned. I hadn't mentioned this plan to the HOA because I knew exactly what would happen. Form 22B, Request for Landscape Modification. Environmental Impact Statement. Proposed Plant Species List. Color renderings. The bureaucratic gauntlet that would inevitably end with a rejection letter because wildflowers weren't part of the approved aesthetic. So I decided to beg forgiveness rather than ask permission. And now, with this warning letter, the HOA had unwittingly accelerated my timeline. I grabbed my phone again and texted Sophie's mother, my ex-wife Lisa. Any chance Sophie could come a day early this weekend? I've got a special project planned. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Lisa and I had a functional relationship post-divorce, but schedule changes always required diplomatic negotiation. She has ballet until 6 on Thursday. Could pick her up after if that works. Everything okay? Everything's fine. Just thought we could get a head start on our garden project. 6:30 Thursday works great. Garden project? I hesitated. Lisa was generally supportive of my parenting choices, but she also knew the HOA rules. She'd been the one who'd initially been drawn to Pristine Pine's orderliness. Just a small pollinator garden. For science. Gerald will have a conniption. I could almost hear her laugh through the text. Lisa had never warmed to Gerald during our brief time living together in Pristine Pines. That's just a bonus feature, I replied. Just make sure Sophie doesn't get caught in the crossfire of whatever war you're starting with the HOA. It's a flower garden, not a declaration of independence. But even as I typed it, I felt a small thrill at the minor rebellion I was planning. Maybe Dolores was rubbing off on me more than I'd realized. That night, I fell asleep with visions of wildflowers dancing in my head, and Gerald Harrington's face turning the precise shade of purple that would clash with the approved Pristine Pines color scheme. ## Chapter 2, Breaking Ground. Thursday evening arrived with Sophie bouncing through my front door, a whirlwind of energy and butterfly clips in her hair. She dropped her overnight bag in the hallway and immediately asked, "Can we start the garden now, Dad? Mom said you wanted to do it tonight." I glanced at my watch. Nearly 7, but the summer sun would give us at least another hour of daylight. "Let's do it," I said, matching her enthusiasm. "I've got all the supplies ready." I'd stopped at the garden center on my way home from work and splurged on proper gardening tools, additional native plant seeds, and even a few already blooming flowers to give us a head start. The total had made me wince, but Sophie's excitement would be worth every penny. We changed into work clothes and headed to the front yard, arms loaded with supplies. I noticed Mrs. Wilson across the street pausing her evening dog walk to observe us with naked curiosity. I waved cheerfully. She hesitated, then waved back before hurrying along, her Yorkie trotting to keep up. "Okay, Professor Sophie," I said, laying out our tools on the grass. "Where should our pollinator paradise go?" Sophie surveyed the yard with the seriousness of a general planning battle strategy. After careful consideration, she pointed to the central portion of the front yard, the most visible section from the street. "There," she declared. "That way the bees and butterflies can find it easily." It was also the spot most visible to passing HOA board members, which gave me a petty little thrill. "Perfect choice," I agreed. "Now, remember what we researched about preparing the soil?" For the next hour, Sophie and I worked side by side, turning over the grass, mixing in compost, and designing our garden bed. We decided on a flowing, naturalistic shape rather than the rigid rectangles favored in Pristine Pines landscaping. As we worked, I explained to Sophie how allowing some areas to grow wild was actually better for the environment than the manicured lawns that dominated our neighborhood. "But why does everyone have plain grass then?" she asked, sensibly enough. I chose my words carefully. Sometimes people get very used to things looking a certain way, and they forget to ask if there might be a better way to do things. "That's silly," Sophie declared, patting soil around a small purple coneflower we just planted. "It is," I agreed, "but people are sometimes silly about rules. Like how Mom won't let me wear my light-up sneakers to school even though they're super cool." I laughed. Something like that. As the light began to fade, we finished planting the starter flowers and scattered wildflower seeds throughout the prepared bed. I set up a simple border of stones we'd selected together, nothing too formal, just enough to signal intention rather than neglect. We were admiring our work when a throat cleared behind us. "Evening, Fletcher, he said, pointedly not extending his greeting to Sophie. I received reports of unusual activity at your residence. Reports. As if we were engaging in criminal behavior rather than gardening. Just planting some flowers with my daughter, I said, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie, this is Mr. Harrington. He's the president of our neighborhood association. Sophie, ever polite, extended her hand. Nice to meet you. We're making a home for butterflies. Gerald ignored her outstretched hand, his eyes fixed on our newly created garden bed. I don't recall approving any landscape modifications, he said. It's just a small flower garden, I replied, keeping my tone light for Sophie's benefit. Native plants, good for the environment. Gerald's mouth thinned to a line so straight it could have been drawn with the same ruler he used to measure lawn infractions. Section 7.3 clearly states that all landscape modifications must be submitted for board approval using Form 22B, with supporting documentation and... Dad, what's he talking about? Sophie interrupted, her voice small. I squeezed her shoulder. Mr. Harrington is just reminding me about some neighborhood paperwork. Nothing for you to worry about. Gerald seemed to finally register Sophie's presence fully. His expression shifted slightly, not quite softening, but recalibrating. Young lady, in Pristine Pines, we have rules to ensure our community remains beautiful. What you've done here. He gestured to our garden, doesn't match our community standards. I felt Sophie stiffen under my hand. But native flowers help the bees and butterflies, she said. Our teacher said they're disappearing and it's really bad for the planet. Be that as it may, Gerald continued, as if explaining to a particularly slow student, we have established landscape guidelines that all residents agreed to upon purchasing property here. We'll fill out the form, I interjected, wanting this interaction to end before it ruined Sophie's excitement. First thing tomorrow. Gerald checked his watch, a large, ostentatious thing that probably violated some cosmic rule of good taste. See that you do. And until approval is granted, I must insist you return this area to its original state. Sophie's face fell. But we just planted everything. Rules are rules, young lady. That's how society functions. I felt my temperature rising, but forced a calm I didn't feel. We'll submit the proper paperwork, Gerald. For now, I think we're done gardening for the evening. I gently guided Sophie toward the house, turning my back on Gerald, a dismissal he could feel but not officially object to. Your application will be reviewed at the next board meeting, he called after us. Third Tuesday of the month. Nearly 2 weeks away. Of course. Inside, Sophie dropped onto the couch, her earlier excitement evaporated. Are they going to make us dig up our garden, Dad? I sat beside her. No, honey. They're just being particular about the process. But our garden is going to help the environment, and that's more important than some silly rules. She looked up at me, her faith in adult reasonableness still somehow intact. Then they'll have to say yes, right? Because it's for the planet? I wished I shared her certainty that logic and good intentions would prevail. We'll make a really good case for it, I promised. Now, how about some dinner? Gardening works up an appetite. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with the dreaded Form 22B. The document ran to 4 pages, asking for everything from specific plant species to maintenance schedules to expected mature height of all vegetation. I filled it out meticulously, attaching a printout about the environmental benefits of native plant gardens, a color-coded diagram of our planting scheme, and, in a stroke of inspiration, printed photographs of similar gardens in other, high-end communities. As I worked, my phone buzzed with a text from Dolores. Spotted Gerald doing his evening patrol at your place. Casualties? I smiled despite my frustration. Direct hit. He caught us planting a wildflower garden. DEFCON 1. Need reinforcements? Not yet. Filing the proper paperwork like a good citizen. Boring. Let me know when it's time for civil disobedience. I've got poster board and a surprisingly steady hand for picket sign painting. I laughed and set my phone aside, returning to the form. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight. The completed application was a masterpiece of malicious compliance, addressing every possible objection before it could be raised. Tomorrow I would submit it with all the required copies, 5, in triplicate, to the HOA office, a glorified storage room in the community center where Gerald played at being a corporate executive. And then we would wait, while our nascent garden either flourished or withered under the weight of bureaucracy. As I finally headed to bed, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time, the righteous indignation of someone prepared to fight for something that mattered. It wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about what kind of example I wanted to set for Sophie. Sometimes, the small rebellions were the ones most worth fighting for. Chapter 3, Neighborhood Watch. The next morning, I dropped Sophie at her summer day camp and took a detour to the pristine Pines Community Center before heading to work. The HOA office was technically open from 9 to 11 a.m. on weekdays, limited hours that seemed designed to ensure maximum inconvenience for working residents. I'd called in late to work for this errand, determined to submit my paperwork in person rather than leaving it in the drop box where it might mysteriously disappear. The community center was a modest brick building that housed a small gym, a meeting room, and the cramped office from which Gerald ran his suburban empire. As I approached, I was surprised to find the office door open and lights on, despite it being only 8:30 a.m. I knocked on the doorframe and peered in to find not Gerald, but Marjorie Winters, HOA treasurer and Gerald's most faithful lieutenant. In her 70s, with a helmet of silver hair and reading glasses perched on a beaded chain, she looked up from a ledger with an expression of mild surprise. "Daniel Fletcher," she said, as if confirming my identity to herself. "You're early." "So are you," I replied, stepping into the office with my thick envelope of forms. I wanted to submit a landscape modification request. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah. Gerald mentioned you might be stopping by." Of course he had. The HOA grapevine was more efficient than any corporate communication system I'd ever encountered. "I've completed Form 22B, I said, placing the envelope on her desk. "With all supporting documentation." Marjorie picked up the envelope and weighed it in her hand, as if assessing its worthiness by sheer mass. "This will be reviewed at the next board meeting," she said, reciting the line I'd already heard from Gerald. "That's nearly 2 weeks away," I pointed out. "The plants are already in the ground. Is there any way to expedite the process? Perhaps an emergency meeting?" Marjorie looked at me over her reading glasses. "Emergency meetings are reserved for actual emergencies, Mr. Fletcher. A broken sprinkler system flooding the community walkways is an emergency. Unauthorized plantings are not." I bit back a retort about the subjective nature of emergencies. "When exactly is the next meeting?" "Tuesday the 18th, 7 p.m. She made a show of writing my name in an appointment book. "You're welcome to attend and present your case, though the board will have reviewed your materials in advance." "I'll be there," I assured her, with more enthusiasm than the prospect warranted. As I turned to leave, Marjorie added, "And Mr. Fletcher? Until the board renders a decision, you are expected to maintain your property in accordance with existing approved standards." I paused at the door. "Meaning?" "Meaning that unapproved garden should be removed until proper authorization is granted." I thought of Sophie's face as we'd planted each flower, her careful patting of soil around the delicate stems. "I'll take that under advisement," I said carefully, and left before she could respond. In the parking lot, I texted my boss that I'd be in slightly later than planned and drove to the local garden center. If the HOA wanted a fight, I'd make sure my side had reinforcements. By that evening, I'd added solar-powered garden lights, 3 ceramic butterfly decorations, and a small stone bench to our garden. Each addition was, technically speaking, another violation requiring separate approval forms. But in for a penny, in for a pound, as my grandmother used to say. Sophie would be back with her mother until Sunday, which gave me time to strengthen our position before she returned. I watered our new garden thoroughly, imagining Gerald driving by and noting each new infraction with mounting horror. As dusk fell, I was arranging the solar lights when a voice called out from the sidewalk. "Going all in, I see." I looked up to find Dolores approaching, walking her ancient basset hound, Beethoven. Unlike most pristine Pines residents who merely power-walked past with tight smiles, Dolores never hesitated to stop and chat. "Might as well give them a comprehensive list of violations," I replied, standing to greet her. Dolores chuckled, her silver bob gleaming in the fading light. Before retirement, she'd been a civil rights attorney, and she approached HOA disputes with the same vigor she'd once applied to constitutional cases. "It looks lovely," she said, surveying our wildflower patch. "An actual spot of life in this mausoleum of a neighborhood." "Sophie designed most of it," I said proudly. "She's on a mission to save the pollinators." "Smart girl." Dolores bent slightly to examine one of the ceramic butterflies. "You know they're going to cite you for these decorations." "Already submitted the paperwork this morning." "And in the meantime?" I shrugged. "In the meantime, the bees get a nice place to visit." Dolores straightened, wincing slightly as her back protested. "You should know, there's a board meeting tonight. Emergency session." That caught me by surprise. Marjorie told me the next meeting wasn't until the 18th. The official meeting, yes. But Gerald called a special session. Technically for pressing community business, but Myra Cook is on the board now, and she texted me that they're discussing recent landscape violations, plural. Myra was the newest and youngest.